So in today's video, we're going to look at chapter 9.5, which looks at other forms of sampling. Okay, so we have looked at voluntary sampling, we have looked at random sampling, but now we're going to look at some others. Just be aware what these are, because in your homework, what you'll have to do is they'll give you a situation and they will ask you what kind of sampling it is. So the first one I want to look at is judgment sampling. You can kind of probably guess what this one is. In this case, what they do is they take an expert in a field, okay, whichever thing you're trying to study and get a sample for. They take an expert in that field and they say, give us a sample for this population, okay? And hopefully, if you've got a good enough expert in your field, they will be able to give you a fairly decent representative sample. The problem is this is all down to someone's judgment. So it isn't always the best sample that you can possibly get, because they may not be as much of an expert in the field as they claim to be. So you may end up with this kind of bias one way or the other. So when you do judgment sampling, all it is the sample is selected by an expert in the field. Okay. Just be aware, as we said, that the sample is down to someone's judgment. So it may not be as representative as we would like. Okay. So that's one type of sampling. Another type of sampling is called convenient sampling. Again, you can probably guess where this one is going to go. So convenient sampling, all this is you start out with your population and you just choose the people that are closest to you or are the most convenient to use in a sample. Okay, so for example, if I was trying to take a survey of the whole of Taylor University, I could just use you guys in my class as my sample, because I have more access to you guys than I do to the rest of the school. Okay, you guys are easier to ask questions to because I teach you on a regular basis, so I get to talk to you a lot more. So it's easier to use you guys in a sample. So convenient sampling is just you choose people in the sample or in the population that are easiest to access. And use for the sample. Okay. As you can probably guess, this thing is by no means representative whatsoever. For example, if I'm looking at you guys in stats, a lot of you are in the same majors, so it may not be the best representative sample that I could have, because a lot of you are in the same majors, or you may all be from the same residence hall or whatever that might be. So convenient sampling, although it's very convenient, it's very cheap, it's very easy, it may not be representative. Okay. Another type is systematic sampling. What this does is it chooses a starting point, and then it will take every nth or kth person of the population to be in that sample. So I could start off with a production line of, let's say, 100 objects, and I want to take a sample of 10, so I could pick every 10th object off of the production line and use that for my sample. So systematic sampling chooses a starting point, and we'll use K as our parameter. Every kth member of the population is in the sample. This can be very representative of the whole population. It can be a very good sample. Your only issue is that there can be some occasions where you have to be very careful of using it. For example, if you're looking at, let's say, a store and you're looking at their sales on, like, their daily sales, you don't want to say, okay, I'm going to take a year's worth of sales and I'm going to take a sample of every 7th day to see on average what your sales were. Well, every 7th day is going to fall on exactly the same day of the week. So if you said, okay, I'm going to take a sample of every single Sunday to see what your sales were for the whole year, well, maybe there's not that many people out on a Sunday that go shopping. So you may not get an accurate representation of the whole population. So you just have to be very careful with systematic sampling that when you are taking every case thing in that population, you have to be very careful that you don't fall into some kind of pattern where it could affect what your answer is. As I said, like if you picked every 7th day when you're looking at daily sales, for example. So just be very careful with that. But as long as you do this correctly, this can be a very representative sample. The next one is cluster sampling. Okay. What cluster sampling does is it divides the population into these groups, okay? Think of natural groupings, whether that be area or whatever that might be. And then you take a sample by just taking certain groups to be in that sample. So you don't take that, we'll do another type in a minute called stratified sampling that's very similar to this, but depending on how you choose these people, it can be slightly different. But with cluster sampling, all you do is divide the population into groups. Okay. Classic example is dividing like the country into areas or states in this case, whatever you might choose. So you divide the population into groups. And then what you're going to do is you're going to pick certain groups and you're going to survey every member within that group. So then pick certain groups. And survey every member of those groups. Okay. There is an example of this where they were saying that there's something like 37,000 McDonald's worldwide, and they wanted to take a survey about the menu for McDonald's. So what they did, instead of choosing McDonald's like randomly, what they did was they divided the world into areas. So whether they looked at states in America or they looked at like provinces elsewhere, all they did was divided the whole world into areas, and then they just chose, let's say, 10 of those areas. So it could be 10 states in America. And they just surveyed those McDonald's in those states, but they surveyed every McDonald's in those areas or those states. It's good in terms of you are choosing multiple areas in order to survey. The problem is that you may not get a whole representative sample, for example, for the rest of the US or the rest of the world, if you just pick certain areas, because some states are very different to other states and some countries are very different to other countries. So it's good that you are choosing multiple areas that you're going to survey, but you're not choosing enough randomly throughout the world in order for this to really be representative. So you have to be very careful with cluster sampling as to how you choose your groups. And you have to make sure that those groups or the areas are far enough apart and far enough diversified that this would actually be a representative sample. But you do survey every single member of the groups that you pick to survey. Okay. Now, slightly different to that, but along the same kind of lines, is stratified sampling. Stratified sampling, again, what you're going to do is you're going to divide the population into these subcategories or groups. So you're going to divide the population into groups. They actually call them strata in this case. It's called stratified sampling. So divide the population into groups. And then all you're going to do is you're going to pick a certain amount of people or objects within each of those stratas to survey. So this time you're just taking a certain amount of people or objects from every single group and surveying them. It's way more expensive to do, but this thing will always give you a representative sample because you are picking people from all areas, from all walks of life, or if you're doing objects, you're picking them from across the board, okay? So you divide the population into groups and then survey a few people from every single group. So you don't survey everyone from a certain amount of groups like we did in cluster sampling. This time you're going to survey a certain amount of people, but from every group. Okay, that's way more expensive than cluster sampling, particularly like in the case of McDonald's, because the reason that they chose certain areas was it cut down on travel costs, because then you didn't have to have someone fly to every single McDonald's all over the place or just fly all over the world for it. They just picked, let's say, 10 areas and said, okay, just go to all the McDonald's in those 10 areas. Well, that's only 10 different places you have to go to. But when you do stratified sampling, you're only picking 2 or 3 from each group, but you have to go to every single group. So you may have to go to every single state in America and only survey, let's say, 3 McDonald's in each area. So it's way more expensive, definitely in terms of travel costs and stuff, in order to do stratified sampling, but it's way more representative.